Good evening to to the Pryor Center and Pryor Center Presents. Tonight we have Bob Cochran, good news for Mr. Emerson, Kent Bonar, Resurrects, Thoreau, and the Ozarks. I'm Bill Schwab. I'm the Director of Education, Research, and Outreach for the Pryor Center. And this is our fourth Pryor Center Presents this fall. We had Lisa Margulis talking about the impact of music on the brain. It was a remarkable talk. We followed that with John Brummett. We had an evening with him talking about national and state politics. If you get a chance, take a look at Janine Perry's talk on our website. It's on our Facebook page. And it was a remarkable talk about why Arkansas became a red state in just 3 election cycles. And tonight we have Bob. This coming spring, we have an exciting program. We have J.D. Wilson, who is a University of Arkansas biologist. He gave a talk at the Clinton School, and it was a smash. He's going to be talking about pythons. And it's just not about pythons. It's about global change and the change in their range. So we will have Pryor Center machetes for sale. 2 for the price of 3. 3 for the price of 2. We'll have the logo on the side. So you can have 1 for the side of the bed, and then 1 in the car, and then 1 near the back door so you can take the dog out. Yeah, that type of thing. I think you all remember I've lived here 40 years, and we didn't have armadillos when we first moved here. Now I hit one once a week. I think you did as well. Angie Maxwell. Angie Maxwell is a professor in political science. She's also the director of the Blair Center, and she's going to launch her book at the Pryor Center. It's called The Long Southern Strategy, How Chasing Voters in the White South Changed American Politics. We also have Siva, and I don't know if I'm going to pronounce this right, Vandayanahan. He is the director of media and citizenship at the University of Virginia. You know who he is because you've seen him often on newscasts, and you've seen him and listened to him on radio. We have in the works an exciting debate between 2 prominent Arkansas politicians or political figures discussing J. William Fulbright's book, Arrogance of Power. And we have 1 commitment. We're waiting for the second. And it's going to be such a turnout, we'll probably have it in the atrium. That's coming up later. So I've explained before, we have 2 operations here. We have the front of the house, and that's what I'm responsible for. And we have the back of the house. That's 6 editing booths. We have a studio in the vault. We also have a control room and staff offices. We do important things in the back of the house. And one of them is Arkansas Memories, which Scott Lunsford does. And we also are going to, through Randy, we're also going to have the KATV Channel 7 archives, which span the 1950s through the early 2000s. The first batch will be up on our website in a few months, and it's searchable. So if you want to know what happened on Grandma's birthday in 1961, you can find out. So we're excited about that. Tonight's talk will be live streamed, and it will also be posted on our website. So pass the word on to your family and pass it on to your friends. We have a short survey. It's on your seat. I hope you didn't sit and hurt yourself with that pencil. But the survey helps us do a better job. And we read them and react to them. For example, we have purchased sandwich boards. The printing will be done by next week, and you'll be able to find where the Pryor Center is starting next week. You needed something to drink. We provided water, but I think I'm the only one that took any. I had to go beg for ice over at Jam and Java. And we're working on the full bar and the margarita machine. That's a little way off. Taco bar, too. I have an idea for you, and Ann and Morris Henry had dinner on the square before the last event. And who did I run into who had drinks over at Vitro? There you are, back there. We're trying to increase the number of people on the square in the evening, and Pryor Center is part of that with our promotion board. And if we want to keep Fayetteville one of the top 5 best places to live, then invest in this place, this square that defines who we are as a community. The Mexican place went under, but they're bringing back a Mexican bar with bar food. Across the way will be a coffee shop, and it's exciting because it's going to be run by people with spectral disorder, autism. They're going to have craft beers, coffee, and sandwiches and salads and that type of thing. And the rumor is that over in the old post office, we're going to have a new Italian restaurant. So come down, have an early meal, have a late drink, or vice versa, but come down to the square. By the way, we will have a newsletter starting in January. If you'd like us to let you know what's going on in the Pryor Center, please write out your email, and we won't ask you for money right away, but we will certainly get it out, what's going on at the Pryor Center. I've known Bob Cochran for decades. He's a professor of English. He's also the director of the Center for Arkansas and Regional Studies. Bob received his doctorate in English literature from the University of Toronto. He's won a Guggenheim Fellowship. He's been awarded 3 Fulbrights. Bob refuses to be specialized. He has written books on topics as remote from one another as the Irish playwright Samuel Beckett and Arkansas movies. His documentary videos include a video on Western swing fiddlers, a maple syrup maker and ginseng digger, and a quilt rug maker. So please welcome Kent Bonar, Resurrects, Thoreau, and the Ozarks. And by the way, Kent Bonar is in the house. So, Bob.
Well, thank you, Bill. It's a pleasure to be here. I've looked forward to this. One of the pleasures of the last 3 or 4 years has been to be affiliated down here with the Pryor Center, and it's given a kind of nice boost to recent work for me. There's several ways you can talk about how long I've been here. The simple fact is I came here in 1976. If you wanted to sort of make it a little more vivid, I could say that I've taught here for 2 centuries. But if you really want to go all the way, you can say, of course, like many of us can, that my time here spans 2 millennia. The reason I bring this up is that when I came here, I already sort of was given 2 hats when I got here. I was hired to teach English literature courses, which is where I had my sort of official certification, you know, the doctorate from Toronto that Bill was kind enough not to mention the date of. And I was also asked to replace Mary Parler as the folklore teacher, which gave me a sort of in with Arkansas studies. And I was a Midlander. I came from Indiana. But I came here and got interested in Arkansas. And sometime in the 1990s, they made me the director of the Center for Arkansas and Regional Studies, which gave me a 3rd hat. And finally, I was asked to run for about a decade the American Studies program. So the upshot of that for me was that I was encouraged at any time, if I got interested in something, no matter how bizarre it was, I could just whip on one of those hats and claim that it was the legitimate subject area for me to work in, which has been absolutely wonderful. And here's the change. And what I really I want to talk about the last 4-year period, because it offered a unique experience, and it had to do with meeting Kent Bonar. But up until that time, every project I undertook was more or less sequential. I'd do a work in literature, and then I'd do something in folklore and something in Arkansas studies, and I tried to just sort of keep the fences far away, you know, so I could always move in whatever direction next interested me. But then in 2014, things changed, and I want to try to make sure I do this the right way. Yeah, so with Act 1, it's about 2 books, and we're going to speed through some of these things. Here's the beginning of the adventure with Kent Bonar. The date is there, November the 11th, 2014, and this is taken at the Fayetteville Public Library. Many of you will recognize that. And Kent is at the center. That's Kent. The star of the show that day is standing to Kent's right, and he's here tonight, and he deserves credit. It's Trey Marley. He brought me to this meeting. He said, maybe, you know, and let me just introduce the other participants. The guy in the Buddhist robes, this is an interesting story for later. His name is Ken Davidson, otherwise known as Yeshe. But he took a 3-year vow of silence just after this meeting. And we finished the book during this period. And I remember going down to the University of Arkansas Press and saying, you know, we can't publish this book because all I know this guy is Yeshe, and he can't talk. He can't talk for another 6 months. And I don't know his other name, which I had this blank space in parentheses. He was also, with Trey, a kind of primary instigator of saving Kent's work. The other two are a couple, and the tallest guy in the back is my brother. And the little handout that you have was designed and printed at his bindery in Indiana, and we'll get to that in a few minutes. He runs a book restoration business, and he and his partner, Marilyn, did this for us. So that happened 4 years ago. 2 days from now will be the 4th anniversary of it. Is that right? 3 days from now will be the 4th anniversary of it. And what I want to do is tell you how this project was unique, because it offered me, at this late point in my career, it offered me a kind of new way to learn stuff. Okay, so we can go through this pretty quickly. There are 2 stars, really, the Kent and the book Kent is holding. So that's the book, and that's the shape it was in at this time. You'll get one other. That book had seen some hard wear. Kent had been carrying it around for 30 years at this time in the woods, mostly in Newton County, but basically all over the state of Arkansas. And there's the title of it. Okay, Kent did not write this book. This book was written by a botany professor at the University of Arkansas, published in 1978. And at the beginning, when we first started trying to get this book reissued, we had no idea where he was. And it was an effort of research to find Edwin B. Smith. But we did find him, and we interviewed him and got to talk to him about writing this book. Unfortunately, he died about 8 or 9 months before the book came out. So he didn't get to see it. But there he is in the University of Arkansas herbarium, and his kids came to the rollout events. So that's where this begins. Shortly after this book was published, Kent got a hold of a copy and started carrying it around in the woods. And he didn't just carry it around. He carried it around and started illustrating it. He started making drawings in it. And what happened was, 30 years later, that cadre of friends headed by Trey Marley and Yeshe were eager to save that book. They were worried that this was the only copy of it and that its existence was fragile, since Ken was carrying it across Ozark streams and had already dropped it into one by this time. So, and had to dry it out a page at a time. So there's Kent. I don't know who took this picture. Kelly, you take this one too? Okay, Kelly took my favorite picture, and we're about to see it. So that's the picture that we used in the book that Kelly took. And there's Kent in Newton County holding the book with his drawings in it. And I got just a couple of slides to show you, the atlas as found. By the way, the first iteration, I'll get to this later, but the first iteration of this talk, this is the second one. The first one was taken to Delhi, India. So the first audience to see these slides was in India, but I'll get to that. So I tried several times, and I could have done it if I'd been a more careful person, but I made several attempts at counting the drawings on that page. And I never got a number lower than 52. So I said it's at least 52, okay? It's copiously illustrated. And this next slide was chosen to show you the kind of range of Kent's drawings. The slide on the left, look at what he does with tree trunks there. I mean, look at the detail of that. The person who scanned this book for publication, Joshua Youngblood, in special collections at the University Library, he's another major player in this story. He told me, because he did such a good job of it, he told me that when he had it on the scanner, he blew it up to the point where the type would pixelate. In other words, if you focused in on a period at the end of a sentence, there'd be holes in the period. There'd be little white dots inside the period. And then if you moved it over at the same level of magnification to some of Kent's lines, they were clear as day still. So the fineness of Kent's line, it's like he was painting with a brush that had one hair in several places. And that's where that's what you get over here. These leaves and things, whoops, steps off the stage, intent upon his pointing. Lucky not to have taken a fall there. So just look at the range of that, from the tree trunks with the density of it to the fineness of the leaf drawings. So there was one copy of this after 30 years. And that's what energized the UA Press to reissue the book as illustrated by Kent, okay? So this is, in some ways, the most revelatory photo for me. This is a still taken from a documentary called The Naturalist, put out in 2001, made by an outfit from Montana. But it featured Kent's work. And when you look at this, Kent is illustrating, there's the book again. Kent is making drawings in the book, but look off to the left and you see a picture there. You see the sort of presiding genius or the inspirational figure that Kent is using is Henry David Thoreau, okay? So we get basically, we're gonna be going backwards just a little bit in time, but for the first part of this book, sort of preparing this reissue of the book, here's a Trey Marley photo. Trey and I would go over there to Newton County and go out in the woods with Kent, and he would choose where we went, always to a bluff, so we'd have a good view. And Trey would set up his camera, and he would videotape at least two interviews of several hours length out there in Newton County. And Trey took this picture. I'm holding a phone. I'm holding my iPhone to record Kent. So this is how we created this second edition of the book, okay? I love this picture, the green of it and everything. And this is the idea. Whenever I get sort of a little down, I say, I get paid for doing this. This is my job. I'm working now, officially. And then I feel better. Here's Bonar at home, ready to go out to the woods. He lives out in Newton County. I'd drive over there, and he'd come out to the car, and we'd head out. There's his pond. Not only Walden has a pond, but Kent's Newton County Walden has a pond. A couple of his dogs are dimly in view over there on the side. And then Kent was brought into the Pryor Center, and Scott Lunsford did an interview.
How were you as far as reading goes? What did you like to read?
Well, Thoreau. Read Walden 3 times in the 5th grade.
Three times in the 5th grade?
Yeah, so I was hooked by then, and I ended up reading Civil Disobedience and Life Without Principle by the time I was in high school. And reread those a few times, and Concord, Merrimack, basically everything Thoreau wrote. Then when I got to university, I got a hold of these journals. They had these big Elephant Folio journals of his, and so I checked every one of them out before I was done.
So this will freeze it for a minute. By the time we started doing this work, basically through the good offices of Bill and his wife Judy, the Center for Arkansas and Regional Studies was affiliated with the Pryor Center. So when we started doing this work with Kent, and I got to know Kent a little bit, I was able to talk him into coming in here, and Scott, and you could see the interview here was done by Scott, and there's maybe 4 hours of these interviews. So it's a great, preservational site. You can come in here and, not only the book itself has been republished by the University of Arkansas Press, but the person who did the illustrations in the book, there's now an extensive record of what motivated that work and how it got done. So it's one of these things where, all the fingers join at a palm, and you get some interesting things done. So now we're moving to the time when this book comes out. When we had the introductory rollout event in Jasper, You know, so press goes over there to sort of Kent's headquarters over in Newton County, county seat of Newton County. We took, I don't know how many we took, Melissa knows, but we took 60 or 70 books over there, and we thought we'd be hauling most of them back. We sold every one, and the same thing happened here at the Botanical Garden. So the next couple of pictures are sort of show that sort of rollout event. And it was at the first rollout event that I met Don House and Sabina Schmidt, a couple of, they are a couple, and they are both photographers. And they were interested in Kent and his work. So just as Kent illustrated Edwin B. Smith's work, Don and Sabina were kind of illustrating Kent's work. Okay, so there's a photo of Kent at work, and there's a Don House photo out in the woods. Just before the book came out, Arkansas Life magazine, that's where this picture comes from, they did a really wonderful sort of essay about Kent and the making of this book. So all these different things are coming together so that, you got this glossy magazine article. And then the next picture, I think, is from the second rollout event. That's Don and Sabina up at the front. Both of those events were emceed by Kelly and Donna Mulholland, better known to many of you as Still on the Hill. And they're good friends of Kent's. When Kent comes to town, he characteristically stays at their house. There's one way to describe Kelly and Donna as Kent's motel, and there's one way to describe me. It's Kent's cab driver. Okay, so over the last 4 years, that's been a very frequent role for the two of us, and longer than that for Kelly and Donna. And Kelly and Donna, really sort of helped organize this whole thing, and they sang at the rollout events, and we got huge crowds. It was just a wonderful feel-good event for all of us. And that's the end of part one. We've taken book one, Edwin B. Smith's Atlas, published in 1978, and now it's been reissued, illustrated with approximately, if I had to make a guess, you know how you make a guess here. You count them on 50 pages and then extrapolate it to your 500. And there's about 6,000 drawings in this book, roughly. And there's Kent signing copies, I believe, at the Botanical Garden. I believe that's the table there. So that's the end of part one. Now we have to jump backwards in time just a little bit. And this is just to demonstrate, how lucky can you be? Joshua Youngblood at the library, Mike Beaker and Melissa at the press, and all the people. Charlie Shields made the poster for this presentation at the press. How lucky can you get? Well, I'm in the English department at the University of Arkansas too, and I went to dinner with my pal Joe Candido. This is not the dinner where this conversation took place. This is in another trip. Joe and I and our spouses have on occasion traveled in the interest of good eating. And this is Craig's Barbecue in Devils Bluff, Arkansas, which some of you may know. It's nationwide renowned for its mustard-based barbecue. But at a dinner at a much tonier restaurant, I was telling Joe and Anne Marie a story that Suzanne had heard many times before about the adventure of doing this book. The book wasn't out yet. I looked it up. This trip took place like in August of 2017. I found an old email between, Anne Marie and Joe and me. And not this trip, but the trip where we talked about this book. And Joe said, as I described what I just told you about working on this reissue with Kent's illustrations, Joe said, you told about how he was interested in Thoreau, how Kent really was inspired by Thoreau. I know a guy in India who's putting on a Thoreau conference right now, and I'm going to write to him and tell him about this. And he did, and I got this letter. It was a fairly long wait, but I got this letter. Again, happened just before the book came out, maybe October of 2017. I get this invitation. What did I do here? I get invited to give a plenary session address. That means like to everybody there, right? At Bharati College at the University of Delhi in March 16th. So 3 months after this book is published and that event, the rollout events that I told you about, I'm in India. And I'm talking about, Kent Bonar. And I loved having a trial run where I could talk about Kent knowing that he would not be there. Okay? He was absolutely defenseless. There was nothing he could do. So here's a little bit of that. I mean, this, you know, they kept me busy. They flew me over there, but the conference was the last thing. Actually, the University of Arkansas flew me over there, but they flew me all over India. I took 12 flights inside India to go give little talks, not about Thoreau or Kent Bonar, but about things I'm supposed to know something about, like Beckett and Wallace Stevens and people like that. So here I am in Gujarat at the outside of this university, and for the first and last time in my life, it's worth the trip for this, I, Bob Cochran, got to stay in a VIP guest house. Okay, you see it says VIP guest house. It wasn't all that fancy, but the title, you know. So now my kids are going to have to show a little more respect because, so anyway, it was just wonderful. Here's, you know, some class and they do, and so that's the last picture of me traveling around in India. That's in Pune, in Maharashtra. And here's the conference. And there's Kent with the picture of Thoreau, right? And I'm talking to a bunch of people in India. So is this way cool or what? I mean, and I get to be 75, I've never gone to India. And then I go twice in 3 months. So it's amazing. And I called the talk To Turn a Watchman. That was the title of the talk in India. And there's a thing from Thoreau's journal. By the way, when Kent mentioned in the clip that he read Thoreau's journal, those of you here who are Thoreau readers and fans will know that to read Thoreau's journal is a huge task. I mean, it was by far, exponentially, the largest work of his career. And he also, Kent used the phrase Elephant Folio. And you people who are bibliophiles, Elephant Folios, the only thing I'd ever seen in Elephant Folio before was Audubon, you know. They're just enormous books, okay? So there's the thing, you know, just in his journal, he says that, and it covers the whole thing. These things there's a break in the thing, but they're both from the same day. And look, the first thing begins with him using a botanical image to describe his activities in life. And the second one is pretty clearly metaphysical, almost, you know, the spiritual dimension of life, if I can get a communication from heaven. And that was kind of a key for me, and the key was derived from hanging out with Kent. This now, and now we get to the heart of what I want to do, or close to it. This is from the last paragraph of Ralph Waldo Emerson's funeral oration when Thoreau died. So just a tiny bit of backstory. Thoreau did not live long. He died at 44. He lived from 1817 to 1862. Didn't quite make his 45th birthday. When he died, Emerson gave an oration. He died on May 6th, 1842. Emerson gave the funeral oration. Then a month or so later, you know, if I'd made notes, I'd give you the exact dates, but he published a revised version of his, an enlarged version of his talk, although even his contemporaries found the talk long. Even by 19th century standards, it was long. But in the last paragraph, he says something that I think can only refer to work that was at that time unpublished. That he clearly found the early death of Thoreau. He said the scale on which his, i.e. Thoreau's, studies proceeded was so large as to require longevity. That if he were to finish the task he set for himself, he would have had to live a long time. And he repeats that, he stresses that by saying, it seems an injury that he should leave in the midst his broken task, which none else can finish. So what I suggested, and I didn't, what I did was remind the people in India of some things that had happened since Thoreau died. And these things happened fairly recently, and I gave you the dates when these books came out. When I was a college student, you know, being required to read Walden and Civil Disobedience, things like that, these books had not been published. And the guy dies in 1862. These books come out over a century later. So already, even if you didn't go beyond this slide, you would have reason to question Emerson's negative conclusion, right? his broken task which none else can finish. Well, let's not worry about finishing now, but let's talk about continuing his task. Clearly, there were people who continued his tasks. There were people who found his work so compelling that they pursued editing and publishing that work that he had left unfinished. So, I'm not a Thoreau scholar, but I know a lot more about Thoreau than I did when I started, thanks to Kent. And it seems clear to me that the reference there can only be to these ecological studies. So Thoreau, I can put it in a sentence to you. Emerson was worrying. Emerson was the most famous. He was far better known at the time of Thoreau's death than Thoreau was. That's been flipped. Thoreau is now much more talked about than Emerson is. More books come out every year, every month on Thoreau. More articles and books come out every month on Thoreau than come out in a year on Emerson, easily. So these books are basically foundational, are now regarded as foundational works in a sort of ecological sense of studying American nature. He's now regarded, Thoreau, thanks to these posthumous works, as a pioneer, as a founding ecological naturalist in the United States. Well, I put those two books together, and this slide I showed them there in India with the Arkansas Florilegium. I said, not only are people publishing Thoreau's stuff, but there's a guy in Missouri who more or less set out to be Thoreau, who's living a Thoreauvian life and doing Thoreauvian things explicitly inspired by his own reading of Thoreau. Kent just mentioned in passing that he'd read Walden 3 times by the time he was in the 7th grade. Any of you try to read Walden in the 7th grade? I was assigned Walden when I was a freshman in college. And I hit the chapter called Economy, and it was like running into a brick wall. I said, I can't read this. This is impenetrable. So Kent found his sort of presiding genius early on. And he's lived a life in accordance with the lessons that he found there. And the last thing I put up was their own program. So that's my title. Good news for Mr. Emerson. That broken task is not broken. It may not be finished, but it's certainly ongoing. Thoreau's task is being carried forward by people like the editors of those 2 books and people like Kent and people like the people in India who put together this conference. So I came with joyous tidings. I came with a gospel to the people in Delhi. Okay, so that's basically part 2. Here's the thing that was funny. This surprised me. This is Joe's friend. This is Joe Candido's friend. He's the foremost Shakespeare scholar. Remember, Shakespeare is Joe's deal here at the University of Arkansas. This is India's foremost Shakespeare scholar, editor of a journal called Hamlet Studies. But he's also a kind of polymath, and he's very active, and he was one of the organizers of this Thoreau conference. So I give my talk. I finish my little talk, and this guy stands up in the back. His name is Rupan Desai, and he's got this shopping bag. Guess what's inside the shopping bag? The copy of the Arkansas Florilegium that I had mailed him. So he comes up to the podium, and there was another guy waiting to give his talk. The guy was freaking out because he thought the session was going to be over, so I had to stop him. But that fellow is the retired Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of India. So there were a lot of bigwigs here. I was in good company. And they wanted, Mr. Desai was donating his copy to the India International Center. And this guy was appointed to receive it. So, and then we got one more slide. I was asked to sign it, and it's a little awkward being asked to sign a book you did not write. Okay, but so you can see how I signed it. Compliments to the India International Center Library, I put the date on it. And then I signed it for Kent Bonar and Edwin B. Smith, the 2 authors of the 2 books. And that's the end of that story. So that came in the side door. I'm not a Thoreau scholar, but I got this free trip to India. I got flown all over the country. And just all because Trey Marley took me into a meeting at the Fayetteville Public Library and introduced me to Kent Bonar. So we're 2/3 of the way through. Oh, I'm going the wrong way. That'll fill you with fear. Okay, tonight, I got one other thing that I want to do, and that's your handout. Here's what, and I think I can put this in a single sentence. I think my reading of Thoreau, which I did partly to understand Kent better, because Kent was, a Thoreau fan. So I started reading books like I had never read Life Without Principle, for example. Kent recommended it, I read it. Kent recommended this book, not by Thoreau, but by a well-known, developer of evolution, sort of the co-inventor of evolution as a concept with Darwin, was Alfred Russel Wallace. And I came to understand Kent. I mean, this slide really describes, it's from the India talk, that I came to approach Kent at three levels. It seemed to me that obviously at the daily level, he gets up and he walks out his door and he goes into the woods and he makes drawings of plants and animals, that he's a naturalist. But by this time I knew him a little better, and on our drives back and forth when I'm his cab driver, he's constantly preparing to appear before public hearings for proposed actions of the Park Service and Department of Tourism and various business interests. And so politically, he has had a long career as an environmental activist. He's a central figure in the Newton County Wildlife Association. And then, in that quote that I gave you, there's a spiritual dimension behind it too. There's a kind of sacramental view of the natural world. So, Kent's one of those guys that says, look, you can approach the divine verbally by reading a scriptural text, or you can approach the divine by looking very closely at the material world and studying the material world just as carefully as you study the scriptural world. So I'd already started approaching Kent along in those three levels and recognizing that they each fed into the other, that they constituted a kind of well-integrated personality, from spiritual view to what you do every day when you walk out your door. Putting it in Frost terms, he had done a very good job of uniting his vocation with his avocation. Okay, so I'm reading these things. I'm reading these Thoreau things, and now since you've got this handout that my brother prepared, I'd like you to have a look at it, because what I did was reread Thoreau's first book, A Week on the Concord and Merrimack Rivers, published in 1849. And I'd read it before, but I hadn't noticed it. I hadn't read it as perceptively. So the heart of what I wanted to tell you tonight is that the experience of hanging out with Kent for 3 years had prepared me to read Thoreau more perceptively. And that little passage you have, it's from the first 10 pages of Thoreau's first book. This is his first book. And as you can see, it's about an 1839 trip with his brother John, his older brother. Actually, their trip was a 2-week trip, but he took an author's license with it and titled his book A Week. The book was a colossal flop. He signed one of the worst contracts I've ever seen for a writer to sign. Basically, his publisher was not a publisher at all. He was simply a hired printer. And so Thoreau paid the printer to print 1,000 copies of his book. And they sent out, 75 or 80 copies. But at the end of the day, after the publisher was storing many, many copies of his book, and he wrote Thoreau repeatedly to say, he had need of the space that he's storing Thoreau's book in. So Thoreau also had to pay to have the books loaded into a wagon and brought to his house. And one day in his journal, he said, and you'll love this, it's typical Thoreau. He said, I am now the proud owner of a library of nearly 700 volumes, over 700 of which I wrote myself. So the book, in other words, the book died an early death. But I read a book while I was studying Kent, again, the newest sort of biographical treatment of Thoreau came out in 2017, beautiful book. I'd recommend it to anybody who's inspired to read more Thoreau. It's called Henry David Thoreau, A Life, by a Notre Dame professor named Laura Dassel Walls. I'd read a previous book of hers about Humboldt, and been impressed by her writing. And so I was already sort of into her as a writer, and it was about Thoreau. So I read it, and she called this book, which I had sort of dismissed, a flawed masterpiece, but a masterpiece nonetheless. And so in the first 10 pages, you find the passage that my brother printed up for you. And I think you'll notice, it doesn't take you long, but the slide helps you do it. It makes that same movement that I had organized my approach to Kent by. That the passage starts out as pure science. You know, that first paragraph there is just a description of fish, specifically shad. And its tone is not elevated, it's matter of fact, straightforward statement. But Thoreau doesn't stay in that mode long. Now I've read more of Thoreau. Thoreau goes rapturous on you pretty quickly. He starts out both feet firmly on the ground, but then rhetorically, as well as inside his head, rhetorically he's flying pretty soon. He's sailing. So, but by the time you're getting halfway through the second paragraph, poor shad, exclamation point, okay? And then you get the wonderful line, maybe the most famous line in this short passage that heads off the last paragraph. Who hears the fishes when they cry? I mean, that just goes to your heart, doesn't it? Because Thoreau did. Nobody heard fish, in 1849. Took him a decade the book comes out a decade after the trip. But look what happens. Let's move to the third one that starts armed with no sword. You get a political dimension right away, which I had failed to know. I mean, it's a one-line thing. It's a vivid line. It's worthy of Edward Abbey, Monkey Wrench Gang. Any of you remember that environmental talk? Here, I mean, it says, he by this time he's identifying with the shad. He's directly addressing the fish. He says, I, for one, am with thee. So he set up an opposition between the corporation with its Billerica Dam, an opposition between the corporation and the fish. And then he says, I'm on the fish's side. I'm hanging out with the fish, okay? And then I shouldn't have been surprised, given what I'd already thought about Kent, that you've got the occupational level, you got the political level. Last paragraph, if destiny is not set up to, at the end of the day, allow those fish up those rivers, he says that he's confident that they will eventually be allowed. And he's flying. Thou shalt. I mean, we're in scriptural language now. We're not saying fish are occasionally taken at such and such a place. His whole rhetorical register is flying now. And he says, thou shalt ere long, before long, have thy way up the rivers, up all the rivers of the globe, if I am not mistaken. He makes a prediction. And then he says, I'm skipping a tiny bit, well, what if my prediction's wrong? What if it were not so? That from now till, where the earth dives into the sun, from now until that day, thou wert to be overlooked, at first and at last. Look at that last line. Then would not I take their heaven. I mean, that's a fabulously incendiary line. And it reminded me, and I wasn't fully prepared to tell the people in India this. So a lot of this has been a second iteration, but from here on, it's sort of first iteration. So I am reminded, I've seen layers in this, thanks to Kent, that I hadn't seen before. And I'm reminded of really famous passages in American literature. And I'm sure most of you will know at least one of them, and some of you will probably know both of them. Here's a climax speech of Captain Ahab's in Moby Dick. And look at the first line. There's a storm going on. It's like the Lear on the Heath level of cosmic involvement. But there's a storm at sea going on. Lightning's coming out, saying almost fire's coming out of the spars. And he's addressing the deity. And he says, I now know thee, thou clear spirit, and I now know that thy right worship is defiance. So then would I not take their heaven? And Thoreau's is earlier. Thoreau's come. I'm not suggesting in any way that Melville plagiarized Thoreau, but that there's this sort of, willingness to, I'd call it Promethean or something. There's this Promethean spirit that these mid-19th century guys have. And what Ahab does, I've loved this passage since I was a kid. He lays out the conditions of his fealty, of his adoration. He says, if you manifest yourself, if the powers that run the universe manifest themselves in thy lowest form as love, then I will kneel and worship. He says, then I'll bend my knee. But if you come as mere supernal power, if you manifest just as power, we're in the rhetoric of the book of Job here, aren't we? Though he slay me, yet will I trust in him. Yet I will maintain my ways before him. Job 13:15. That's what's being said here, by Captain Ahab, a kind of, crazed figure. But nevertheless, he says, if you come as love, I'm dropping to my knees, But if you come as mere supernal power, and then he's flying too, though thou launchest navies of full-freighted worlds, there's that in here which doesn't give a damn, is indifferent. So the one thing I control is my knee, is bending my knee, and I control that absolutely. And there's Thoreau. Then would not I take their heaven. Here's the more famous one. That's pretty famous. That's Moby Dick. Okay. I bet you most of you know this passage. This is Huck Finn. He's already written a note to Miss Watson, who owns Jim, the slave, the escaped slave, telling Miss Watson where Jim is being hidden. Okay. And, totally different rhetoric. Now we're in a much more vernacular, not inflated, Melvillian rhetoric. It's but I won't read the whole thing, but that one line, all right then, I'll go to hell. And so he makes his choice. And so all three of them are in defiance of what they understand as sort of the cosmic order. Thoreau in potential defiance of it, Ahab in actual defiance of it, but it's still an if clause. If you come as love, then down my knee goes. Here he thinks he's damned himself. Huck Finn thinks he's damned himself. And he says, it was awful thoughts and awful words, but they was said, and I let them stay said. So finally there's the same indomitability that's there in Ahab and there in Thoreau. And so my whole point, the heart of everything I've said to you tonight, is I was able to learn as a septuagenarian in a way that was unique in my whole time. That I was studying pages, but part of what was teaching me about the pages was hiking with Kent Bonar. So I was learning out in the world and learning from the page, and each one was helping the other. And there's no real efficient way to say that, but I've done the best I can. So this is my last slide. So there's back to Don House's portrait of Kent in the woods. So here's what it's really just a statement of indebtedness. That if I did read Thoreau more perceptively, and I think I did, then the biggest single reason for that was 3 years of hanging out with Kent. And then the biggest reason I got to hang out with Kent is that I got invited to that meeting back in 2014 at the Fayetteville Public Library, convened by Trey Marley. And then all these people helped. People at the library who scanned the book, Scott who did this interview. So what's shared in all these, and I wanted to make sure that by all these I include Huck and Ahab and Thoreau and Kent. That this is, by the way, it's from the same passage. It comes between the beginning, thy right worship is defiance, and the end, there's that in here which yet remains indifferent in the Moby Dick passage. This passage comes in the middle. And he admits his nothingness, you know, though but a point at best. And he means himself. I'm just a point at, I'm a mite, you know. But while I earthly live, as long as I'm alive, as long as I'm on this earth, I love this phrase too, in a book absolutely absent of female presence. There's a book that's Moby Dick, right? There are no women in the book to speak of. But he feminizes the essential part of his personality. He says, the queenly personality lives in me and feels her royal rights. Well, we don't hear a lot about the queenly personality these days. But in the middle of the 19th century, there are a lot of people feeling the queenly personality. They were walking around. And I've always been drawn to people like that. I've always been drawn to figures who are insistently themselves, no matter how eccentric that makes them. And Kent's the latest. And it just bled over into all the hats that I wear. I'm basically, in the thing I gave you at the beginning, I started out as a kind of folklorist or regional studies guy. That's why I got invited to this meeting. And I ended up as an English prof. Thanks very much. How can there be questions? Yeah. Yeah.
Just from early in your presentation, I was curious where you found, was it Edmund Smith or the original?
Yeah, I found him in an assisted living facility in Rogers. And again, I was assisted there. Some of you may know Sue Madison. Sue Madison was a botany major, the spouse of Dean Madison from Fulbright College. She was a botany major when she was a college student, and she had kept in contact with, and I just kept calling people. And somebody said, I think Sue Madison kept in touch with Ed Smith. It's a long story and I can't tell it, but it also had redemptive, in fact, I will tell this one story because it involves Kim Smith, who died just less than a year ago. Kim Smith went with me to see, he didn't help me find him, I'd already found him. But when I found him, he was, I want to be unprofane here, but he left the university angry. Ed Smith retired in anger and swore he'd never set foot on campus again. And then like 20 years later, Sue Madison leads me to him. I find that out. He's got nothing good to say about the University of Arkansas. I tell Kim Smith, and Kim Smith goes out with me to meet him and was just wonderful. Told him how much, he admired his work and stuff. And you could see him. He just mellowed the guy out. And the guy was, quite happy with Kim's visit. And Kim talked, and Kelly will remember, Kim came and talked to the rollout events for the Arkansas Florilegium. So a quick answer to your question, relatively quick by my standards, is that I was led to him again by people in the community, in particular Sue Madison. And he, and I met his wife, who was in better shape than he was, although she predeceased him. And she became the project's most vocal supporter. When she was in hospice, I got a call from their son and said, my mother wants to talk to you. So I drove out there and she said, get this book done. That's all she said. And then she dismissed me. She said, get this book done. So, and I told her that unless I was hit by a bus, I would. And it's been out for a year now.
Was it possible that was the only copy that he was carrying around?
Well, no. There are a number of, I misspoke myself if I gave that impression. It's the only copy with Kent's drawings in it.
Oh,
okay, you got it? Yeah, with 6,000 drawings, which made it uniquely valuable. I think we could all agree, right? Yeah, in fact, Kent was reluctant to give up his book. He'll remember this because he was still drawing in it at that meeting in 2014. And Marilyn got her phone out. This shit, I'd had never thought of doing this. And she said to me, she was sitting right next to me, she said, I can get you a copy of this book for $80. So I ordered the book. We gave Kent a new untouched copy so he could be drawing. And we stole his 30 years, 6,000 illustrations book and carried it over for Joshua to scan it. But he let us have it. Kent let us have it. but Marilyn's helping me get a second copy, made it easier for him to do. Probably felt a little naked without that book, didn't you, Kent? Kent was one level, since, I mean, this isn't your question, but Kent and I corresponded. We talked, and I sent him drafts of stuff I was writing. And at one point, that book that I mentioned to you, the Alfred Russel Wallace book, he had told me to read it, and it was a task, because it was a long book and it was detailed. And I wrote him a note, and I said, does this stuff about directive mind come pretty close to your own views about creation? You know, that the world is such a complex and beautifully integrated place that there must have been some kind of directive consciousness, that, you know, a creator, as it were. And, you know, I phrased it in fulsome terms. You know, does this come fairly close to articulating your view? And Kent wrote in the margin, he wrote, yep. YEP, yep. And so it was, you know, I didn't have time to go into that, but doing this kind of work is an intricate dance. It has a social dimension. You're writing letters, you're sitting on bluffs, and, you know, but it's in my whole time here, those 2 millennia, this is a unique experience. I've never had a time where I was learning by hiking and learning by reading at the same time. So that was the heart of it. Does that cover the? Yeah.
I have a question. Great story about the making of the book. I'm curious what. Thank you. I'm curious about how the book is doing, and I'm not even sure how to characterize this book, but in the marketplace for books like this, how's it doing? And what's the future of the book beyond the first blush of its appeal in Arkansas and this part of the world?
You know, I'm not the person to answer that, and I think she's here. Melissa, are you within hearing, Melissa? How's this book doing?
Well,
Melissa's the marketing director at the press, by the way.
we really didn't quite know what to expect from it. It's unlike anything we've published, and we had to print more in a hurry when it first came out, so that's an indicator. And at the press, you know, we don't always think only about sales. We also think about, you know, getting recognition for it, reviews, the Arkansas Life story. So it's doing well, and we're real happy with it.
We have time for one more question. No?
I want to recognize one other person because I think he got here after I started, but is that you, Don, out there? It's Don House? Yeah, Don's here. Is Sabina here? No. Okay. So he was, you know, I don't know when you got here, but he got no money for us using his photographs, and he wrote me that he would be here to protect his professional interests. So anyway, that might have been the biggest single reward. In fact, this is a great way to close. That might have been the biggest new reward of that first release event in Jasper, because Don and Sabina were part of the program. Don had done the photographs for this Arkansas Life article, and it was that's where I met them. And they said, this is just to look to the future. You know, I see this as the end of this 4-year run. I don't plan to get up and talk about Kent unless, you know, I don't think I'll be asked to do this again. India and Arkansas, that's a good twofer. But Don and Sabina came up and said, you know, we're working on a project. They didn't tell me anything about it. They were a little mysterious because they didn't want to rain on the parade of this thing. They said, could we meet with you and, you know, after this is over? And, you know, so we met in Arcegas a couple months later, and they told me about a project they're working on. And sort of as a teaser to close this with, either the 3rd or 4th volume in the Arkansas Character Series, Kelly's and Donna's book was the first one, Kent's is the second one. Either the 3rd or 4th one will be Don and Sabina's project, and I hope to get to write the introduction for that one too. So, okay. Thank you all for coming. It was a real old home week here.
Thank you, Bob. And remember, Pryor Center presents in the spring. Thank you.